Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I wasn't able to join you yesterday. I'm Jennifer Hendrickson White. Really interested in the conversations that you've been having and the ones that will continue today. I hear I missed a very good time yesterday evening, which is unfortunate, but I look forward to chatting with you all today. We have three different presenters this morning on the topic of drivers and obstacles around the indivisibility of the two theaters from the vantage point of Italy, Japan, and European players. Um, I'm really excited to hear these different presentations and look forward to the conversation afterwards. So what I would like to do is have everyone present in the order that they are in the agenda, and then I'll respond a bit afterwards, and then we'll throw open the floor for discussion of the topics that are raised. Any other housekeeping issues? Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Guys, thanks for being here. And I'm not Lorenzo Termine, clearly. Unfortunately, Lorenzo couldn't join, and so I had to substitute him at the last minute as the organizer, who, funnily enough, has some recent research that can be introduced in the context of this very conference. But while Lorenzo was going to focus on Italy's position in terms of its security embrace of the Indo-Pacific, the drivers and the obstacles towards also a greater engagement on the basis of recent research that Lorenzo has made as a Max Weber Fellow here at EY, I'm actually going to talk about the European dimension. And I will do so from a vantage point, to start with, of understanding really and unpack the drivers that have qualified, that have pushed for European security intervention in recent years in the faraway seas of the Pacific Ocean. That's the key research question. I have published an article a couple of years ago that tries to tackle this very question from a vantage point of the EU and its key member states. And the answers that had been given traditionally were the ones that emphasize the agency and the leadership role of France, which has, of course, territorial stakes and maritime stakes in the region. It has a massive set of exclusive economic zones in the so-called Indo-Pacific, and those maritime interests drive France's willingness to secure its own stakes, including citizens that live in the Western Indian Ocean or in the Western Pacific territories. Then, of course, there is the driver that comes actually from the United States in many ways. The United States push for Europe to do more in the Indo-Pacific, which is, of course, very often code for countries other than China, especially India and Southeast Asia, with a dimension that can be declined in many different ways, but effectively it's aimed at engaging countries around China's periphery, starting with perhaps South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia, all the way to Southeast Asia and India. Yes, and I just called Taiwan a country, which, of course, I abide by Max Weber's definition of a country. If you have monopoly of power over specific confines, that is a state to many effects. But there is also an argument that posits that, yes, there has been an echoing of US desiderata. But this is to all effects also a very much European process aimed at a third way of not being equidistant between the US and China. So there is certainly alignment with the United States, but there is at the very same time an appreciation of the security dilemma dynamics that are unfolding in the region in terms of US-China strategic competition, and hence trying to cut up a space for Europe and European member states for many different reasons that I'm going to unpack in its projection, security projection into the Pacific. And the article I had published a couple of years ago actually emphasizes in many ways the third way approach, with an emphasis on multilateralism. This was especially true in 2021, I would say, and the interest in the very rich procurement market of the region, both as customers, potential customers, but also as potential defense industrial collaboration partners. And so this is in many ways what has fed European countries' more proactive security role, aside from the factors that I mentioned earlier. And I would say that this specific mercantile driver was perhaps the leading engine. Now, what has changed since 2021, when an EU strategy for cooperation of the Indo-Pacific was unveiled, is that we did have a marriage, really, an alignment of planets between the Geopolitical Commission led by Ursula von der Leyen and the Biden administration. This was particularly true in the aftermath of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine in February of 2022, where you did see also a tit-for-tat logic, if you want, of having the ability to reciprocate the help that the United States of America and Indo-Pacific players, specifically Japan, South Korea, to a lesser extent Australia, have been able to provide in supporting Europe diplomatically, financially, sometimes by a triangulation also with military aid or non-lethal aid. And that kind of support, especially the support coming from the United States in terms of intelligence, procurement, and logistical support, has effectively translated and even, countering cyber threats and hybrid warfare tactics from Russia in Ukraine. That kind of support has, to all effects, translated into a greater alignment, superficially at the very least, on the United States' foreign and security policy priority, which is, of course, China, or shall we say, the Indo-Pacific. And so this is also a byproduct of, to sort of paraphrase Macron, it's a measure of Europe's strategic dependency on the United States. This kind of logic has been particularly evident with Central and Eastern European countries. And also, if you want, this, you can unpack it and see it as fostering a greater discourse, which really was becoming more prominent in 2021 and 2022 and 2023, of a strategic analogy between Ukraine's plight with Taiwan's very plight. And so this kind of narrative, according to which today's Ukraine situation could be also Taiwan's future crisis, became a de facto discourse rather than just a narrative. I think that a historical reinterpretation of how the Indo-Pacific itself gained wider currency is in order. And this is all very recent history, but we need to unpack it and see perhaps the diplomatic archives in the near future to understand really how a geographic reconceptualization of the region, one that has very different cartographic and normative definitions, because the Indo-Pacific is a reinvention. It's a socially reconstructed reinvention of the region, a region that used to be called Asia-Pacific. Again, Asia-Pacific too is an actual recent byproduct, which was incubated in the 1960s, but really picked up with neoliberal-led globalization in the 80s and 1990s. Indo-Pacific is, in many ways, a geopolitical concept that emphasizes the countries other than China, especially the big poles such as India, Southeast Asia, and it provides an alternative roadmap to a Sinocentric redefined region by emphasizing the role and the heft of countries other than China, the ones I've mentioned earlier in particular. What is not appreciated well enough is that Japan had a leading role in crafting this narrative, a narrative that was sold to the policy planning staff of the State Department in 2017, and the United States government actually then appropriated under the first Trump administration to eventually also advocate for its own acquisition vis-à-vis its allies. And so that's the reason why you get the United Kingdom buying into the Indo-Pacific narrative. It's also a measure of the UK's post-Brexit UK giving control, if you want, to DC. And it's also a byproduct of Czechia, a landlocked country, having an Indo-Pacific strategy. Yes, there is a strong anti-China bias, but there is also clearly a reflection, if you want, of moral suasion campaigns coming from elsewhere. Similarly, you could argue that this is what has taken place in Lithuania. It is funny that actually major European Union member states, such as Germany, were allergic to appropriating the word until 2020, when ASEAN did its own ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, that is a very different definition of the Indo-Pacific, one that is inclusive and one that is effectively open potentially to all players. And that kind of inclusivity, including the fact that it can hardly be qualified as a strategic document, legitimized then a buy-in from Germany in 2020. So basically what we're talking here is about a Rorschach test. The Indo-Pacific means very many different things according to very different governments, and it's also very contextual to time and space. And this is actually a logic that is appreciated by Russia and China. During the February 2022 summit between the US, between Russia and China, between Xi and Putin, the joint statement, sorry, the slide is mistaken, it's February 2022, ahead of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There is a jab and a criticism that is specific to the US version of the Indo-Pacific. So there is an appreciation of these nuances. And I would emphasize that really, if Japan was leading from behind under the first Trump administration in advocating a specific role for the US government to play, including in the first island chain and the new geopolitics of the first island chain, you see a unity of intents under the Biden administration with the Japan-US alliance working in lockstep. You see it, again, earlier on with the first Trump administration, including with the strategic narrative of a free and open Indo-Pacific. You see it with the embrace of the economic security agenda. You see it with strategic connectivity initiatives such as the Blue Dot Network, which was really led by the United States, with Japan on the back of it, leading from behind. You see it in many ways with NATO's engagement with IP4, which was, again, something that the United States put on top of the agenda of the London summit in 2019, but of course, Japan was very much welcoming for. And you see it with the new geopolitics of the first island chain. And I would argue that this gets to new heights with the provision of international public goods and with really the ability to leverage minilaterals and for the projection of allied power in the region, including interoperability under the Biden administration. And I think that the ultimate sign of this kind of alignment was really dating back to the Biden era, almost like a bygone era now, where you see Japan and the United States working in lockstep to put Taiwan front and center of the G7 agenda, to also enforce new force posture and military doctrine chains around the first island chain, with a division of labor where there is an expectation for European and specifically G7 players to focus on gray zone activities, but also Japan. But Japan would also be important in kinetic scenarios. I think that what is important in the reminder, 5 minutes, I'm gonna go a bit overboard, I'm sorry. So I'll talk for 20 minutes. Is that you do see Europe aligning as a byproduct of this sort of unity of intent and of the very factors I mentioned earlier. There is an alignment with specific reference to maritime security, with greater military signaling and even European players exercising in the Pacific, sending military assets to the Pacific. Even Italy would send warships and an aircraft carrier. And some of these players also doing freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. Some of them also going through the Taiwan Strait. But what is interesting here, and it's important to emphasize, is that there is preliminary evidence, including from Lorenzo's own research, that there is a strong US ask, especially dating back from the Biden era. There was a strong US ask of doing more, do something, just show up. And so clearly you do see an independent variable, if you want, impacting and influencing the foreign policy options of middle powers that are allied with the United States as a byproduct of a very dependency also in terms of security provisions to Europe. At the same time, however, there has been a heightened profile, a military profile in the region, but these hardly qualify as military, as costly signals. These are gestures. There's hardly a strong political cost in terms of a once in a while passage of a warship across the Taiwan Strait. And it's also at the very same time true that these warships and these military assets, these platforms, can be showcased for the purpose of military procurement goals. And so when Italy sent its multi-purpose patrol vessel in the region, the Morosini, that was showcased to Southeast Asian countries for the purpose of selling that specific asset. And this logic is at play with France, with Germany, and others. There is that very same logic also at play with connectivity, which is arguably much more strategic when it comes to the United States and Japan and Australia in terms of enforcing and actually denying a sphere of influence, denying China a sphere of influence in Southeast Asia, or conversely propping up India and Australia's own sphere of influence in South Asia and the Pacific. So there is this very strategic dimension. But arguably, there is less of that character when it comes to Europe's engagement, because there is a very strong mercantile interest in engaging with economies that are fastly growing, especially India and Southeast Asia. And that is precisely why it's hard to align with like-minded countries, because there is competition. There is competition in the procurement market, and there is competition in the connectivity market. And connectivity very often rhymes with investment and FDI. But there is the potential for collaboration in the defense industrial domain. And in the remainder 2 minutes, I'll just like to picture at the NATO and EU level how this kind of dynamic worked out in terms of concrete deliverables. You've had a unity of intent, again, really under the Biden years, with a clear embrace, both at the NATO and EU level, of the so-called IP4 players, nominally Japan, South Korea, Australia, and to a lesser extent, New Zealand. And this is reflected in the NATO IP4 framework, but also in the EU's security and defense partnerships. And not by chance, the EU has a security and defense partnership with Korea, South Korea, and Japan, and it's negotiating one with Australia. So you see there is a kind of duplication. And you do see that there is, however, a specialization. You know, you have intelligence sharing at the NATO level on China matters, especially coming from the United States, but with some degree of intelligence coming from other players. And that intelligence is also aimed at socializing European players. There is defense industrial cooperation taking place at the NATO level with IP4 countries. And this usually takes place in terms of interoperability, standardization, providing frameworks. While at the EU-Japan level, the defense industrial cooperation might actually work by providing EU-wide financial resources. And the EU conversely focuses more on the economic security agenda, which is actually the EU's remit, the economic and trade remit, with supply chain and de-risking as perhaps paramount to EU-Japan cooperation. And I'll conclude by actually answering the very question we asked for this panel. What are then the old and new obstacles? If this is the cooperation that we see, the drivers can actually take place in terms of defense industrial cooperation, in terms of intelligence sharing, because it transcends boundaries, because there are win-win qualities, there are complementarities, and you can actually cooperate on low-hanging fruits that again are relatively low cost, transcend boundaries, such as in the cyber domain, in the foreign information manipulation interference domain, in the diplomatic coordination domain. What is going to be trickier is projection, and the very fact that we are also competitors in the connectivity and defense industrial domains as well. And that we're also, as mentioned very often in these kind of discussions, we're also structurally dependent on the United States, and we might even compete for the United States military protection. And that dependency on the United States also translates into a preference for defense industrial projects with the United States, right? Rather than among Europe and IP4 players such as Japan. And then, of course, you have a new US government that is now defined by new schools of thought, such as the Make America Great Again school and the Asia Prioritizers, which effectively translates into an emphasis on Europe to focus on its own strategic neighborhood and to discount forward deployment in the faraway region, Europe in Asia, and conversely Japan into Europe. And at the same time, you have costs imposed by tariffs and extorted investments in the United States by the Trump administration. And last but not least, you have a policy vis-à-vis Russia and Taiwan that is coming under question, coming from the United States, especially the White House. And so Ukraine today, East Asia tomorrow has a different echo, which is forcing European and East Asian capitals to play it by ear and to adapt to new potential challenges also originating from Washington, D.C. And I think I concluded. Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And we'll go on to our second presenter.
I'm Liselotte Odgaard, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, and I am going to speak about the Arctic and how I would argue Russia and China are actually merging those two regions through their actions, thereby encouraging the US and its allies to mirror that development. So I'm going to start by saying something about the strategic importance of the Arctic region, what kind of challenges and threats the US and its allies are confronted with there from Russia and China, and what can be done to mitigate those threats. So, first of all, if we look at the strategic importance of the Arctic region, I think by now most people would agree that Russia is prepared to, or has demonstrated that it's prepared to use hard power to expand its territory and its influence, and is creating security buffers against NATO, and is also trying to rebalance European security perspectives in its favor, hence sort of trying to change the political dynamics of borderland countries in Europe that are located near Russia. In the Arctic, Russia began militarizing the region in earnest in 2014, I would say, so more than a decade ago. For various reasons. It's not just important in a military strategic sense, it's also economically important for Russia. So depending on who you ask, it's the Arctic accounts for maybe 7 to 10% of Russia's GDP, and there are important natural resources there. There's hydrocarbon resources, gas and oil, and also fish is a very important resource in that region. And then it's also, its vast Arctic coastline is Russia's national maritime waterway that connects the communities along the way and also connects Russia to the European region and to the Indo-Pacific region. So for various reasons, Russia began militarizing the Arctic at an early stage. It had good reason to do so. It had a vast area to patrol. And indeed, that was by a lot in the West. I worked for Arctic Command, etc. That was seen as a natural thing that we shouldn't worry about. So only very late did NATO allies begin to see this as problematic from a security, defense, and security point of view. And I would argue that NATO allies only began strengthening its force posture in the Arctic in 24, which is like a decade later. That was then in the later stages of the Biden administration, when the ICE Pact was launched between the US, Canada, and Finland to acquire more icebreakers. Almost all of the Arctic nations, except for the Kingdom of Denmark, launched Arctic security and defense initiatives in 24 before the Trump administration came into office for the second time. So for that reason, I would argue that Russia has managed to build up a sort of substantial, credible, and complex threat towards the US homeland and also the homeland of other NATO allies. Russia has, of course, as mentioned, focused on developing the commercial potential of its national Arctic maritime waterway, the Northern Sea Route. And it always needed a partner to do that. It needed a partner to be able to afford and have the technology to build hard and soft infrastructure, to invest in energy, fisheries. And the West and Japan and others used to be part of that. But now, today, of course, China is that partner, coupling the Northern Sea Route to its polar Silk Road. The Arctic is a vast and complex region, and I think we need to distinguish to an extent between the Barents Sea side of the Arctic with the Nordic countries and the Bering Sea side that borders towards the North Pacific, at least when it comes to looking at Russia-Chinese cooperation here. Because in the Barents Sea region with the Nordic countries, I would say that China's priority is not to have any significant presence in a military sense itself, but it does serve China's purpose to have Russia pose a stable, hybrid, and hard power threat to NATO, because that takes the heat off China in its own region. The Arctic is not high on China's agenda. It's low compared to all the hotspots in its near abroad. It's trying to consolidate its influence. It's in its home region. So it doesn't really have an interest in opening another front against countries that it would like to continue to cooperate with insofar as Europe remains open to at least partially friendly relations with China. So China's influence here is very indirect, but there's a lot of things China can do that doesn't come down in the notebook as military assistance. Just to mention one thing, China has some of the world's most advanced logistics systems to couple maritime, air transport, rail, road. That technology can be shared with Russia and, of course, be good for commercial purposes, but it can also be very good for military purposes. So it's just to say that we don't always see. It's difficult for us to detect this kind of cooperation and put it down as something that has military use, but that doesn't mean it's not there. In the Eastern Arctic, it's in the Bering Sea region, it's different. Here, there is intensified cooperation between the two on infrastructure, dual use stuff such as container freight, and also military cooperation. And that includes base sharing, exercises, coming closer to Alaska and Canada and leading them to regularly intercept not only Russian vessels and aircraft, but also Chinese. China would not rely on Russia for having access to the Arctic. As for other countries, they also think that their big neighbor has an unpredictable political future looking over the next decade and beyond. And China has made sure it has acquired all the capabilities to operate across the Arctic independently from Russia, provided it has access to repair and replenishment facilities in Russia's Arctic ports, which it has. But should something happen in Russia, it has domestically built icebreakers, it has semi-submersible vessels to conduct salvage operations, it has more satellite surveillance or more effective satellite surveillance than Russia, etc. So it has sort of all, and it also has uncrewed systems, underwater, aerial, that it has tested for many years, initially out in the open in fora such as the Arctic Circle Forum, openly, using scientific expeditions that are, of course, dual use when it comes to, for example, submarine operations for that purpose. So it has all the capabilities to operate independently, and it has established a strategic foothold with the help of Russia that would allow China to increase its presence in future should its agenda in the Arctic change. Therefore, it is also important to follow how China approaches the Arctic. I would say the main problem right now is that Russia and China, they develop joint hybrid and military operations in the Arctic, which causes the Arctic region and the North Pacific region to be merged. Then the complex nuclear threat from Russia, which doesn't just include land-based missiles, but also its strategic submarines that are nuclear armed. That threat is a homeland security for the US and its allies because we have not invested much in the Arctic. So, for example, part of the airspace over Greenland and the North Pole is largely unsurveyed, and the same goes for the underwater situation along the coast of East Greenland, where the Russian submarines would hide to reach the Atlantic. And once they reach the Atlantic, we have trouble detecting them. So it's not an issue that the US thinks it can ignore anymore. And therefore, it is encouraging, it's investing itself in capabilities, but also encouraging other Arctic allies to do the same. The US is the only ally whose interests span all of the Arctic from the Barents Sea to the Bering Sea. It is therefore, I think, also the only country who's really well positioned to coordinate joint operational planning, joint acquisitions, or coordinated acquisitions to ensure that there is a more credible deterrence and defense in the Arctic than is the case now. As it is now, Russia expands its area of operation, and it does so successfully without us actually doing much about it so far. So for the moment, it's not a very effective deterrent that we offer. And it does encourage China and Russia to cooperate more closely and to develop their concept for joint operations. And they have the advantage of operating along the Northern Sea route and can easily get from the Bering Sea to the Barents Sea. So they are merging those two regions slowly but surely. It is therefore not only the North Pacific and the Bering Sea regions that are coming together, but also the Baltic and the Barents Sea region. So all the way down from the Baltic Sea and over to the North Pacific, there is a sort of coming together of Russian, Chinese thinking about the Arctic. How can we then, what can we do about this? I think, well, it's obvious that we've had a very defensive posture, and there's a lot of gaps in our surveillance, just ability to detect submarines, etc. So I think, and that clearly doesn't work because, as mentioned, Russia and China are expanding their presence, so a more offensive force posture would probably be timely, and that could be, for example, exercises in Russia's exclusive economic zone, because they do the same with us. It could be base sharing agreements near where Russia has its bastion defense in the Barents Sea at the Kola Peninsula, and then also at the Sea of Okhotsk near Japan. That could raise the cost for Russia of trying to expand its submarines area of operation, as is happening now. We could also establish a more dense and reliable network of monitoring capabilities. That's a problem. That would require, I think, ice-strengthened patrol vessels that can manage some level of sea ice. Underwater sensor networks, perhaps utilizing some of those medium underwater platforms that can have sensor packages with them. You could actually create a kind of network, at least from North Pacific and up to the Arctic on the Bering Sea side, which is now currently not, we don't have that, and that would help close ISR gaps across the Arctic and adjacent regions. And that would, again, of course, strengthen maritime domain awareness and also infrastructure resilience. And I know the Canadians have tried to engage Japan and South Korea, which they have been reluctant in a couple of years ago, but are talking about doing it again because there is more interest in it now. Then you could also have coordinated icebreaker patrolling in the Arctic Ocean, perhaps even along Canada's Northwest Passage, although that's a sensitive area. And here you could use commercial and military assets to mitigate Russia, who's likely to, well, they show up in places where they shouldn't be, or they seem to start patrolling in areas that they claim, but that are subject to contested claims, for example, from Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark. So more presence, again, in remote areas where we're being tested and where these countries show up unannounced and where we don't even discover them often would also be helpful. Yeah, and then as mentioned, I think that we need to integrate our naval warfare operations into 2 coordinated force postures in the Arctic and the North Pacific to strengthen interoperability and, again, deterrence. And this would be a response to Russian and Russian-Chinese integrated operational plans that couple the 2 theaters together. I also think South Korea has polar-capable port and shipbuilding infrastructure, and that can be used to establish a dual-use presence from the North Pacific and along the Northern Sea route. China has opened a container route this year. They're working on having an all-year container route along the Northern Sea route together with Russia, and we should try to do the same, again, to create more awareness of what is going on in that area. And that, I think, would need to be a dual-use presence. So to conclude, I think that the key aspects of an adjusted allied force posture would require some operational adjustments. They can be carried out to an extent in the short term with changing the exercise regime, having more base sharing arrangements, etc. But many of the adjustments does require building and buying additional capabilities, some of which are not fully developed yet technologically. There is also an escalation risk if you adopt a more offensive force posture that may discourage Japan and South Korea from participating. So that's a balance. But I do think that in this vast region, allied coordination of ISR and patrolling is essential to build credible defense and deterrence, both in terms of operations and in terms of acquisitions. I don't think the existence of different threats perceptions is a problem. I think it's an advantage because you can then have countries focusing on different areas where they have major responsibilities, thus taking the heat off the US, because it's also clear the US is not willing to pay for the majority of what's needed in the Arctic. Just to give an example, if we think we need 9 ballistic submarines to handle a warfare situation with Russia in the Barents Sea, the US is only likely to send one of those ballistic submarines. The rest has to come from Europe. So there needs to be a rebalance in who does what and who's responsible for what. I don't see that as a breakdown of the alliance system, but it's an adjustment to transfer some of the cost and responsibilities to other allies. And I think Japan and South Korea would be good partners in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I found that really fascinating and a great opportunity to focus on this really critical region. So we've heard the perspective from Europe. We've heard the perspective from the Arctic and Northern Europe. And I want to invite our colleague Murano-san to give us the Japan perspective.
First, thank you very much, Jurio, and to inviting me here and to organize the workshop. I'm a Masashi Murano, working at the Hudson Institute, the DC-based think tank, same as the Liz, and also that I'm in charge of the U.S.-Japan, mainly focused on the U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation and the future force planning. I would like to start the confirming our simple fact. Now the Europe and Indo-Pacific are not one unified theater. We are, geographically, institutionally, and even alliance structure, we are separated. And transatlantic alliance and hub and spokes alliance architecture in the Pacific, the region we do not share the common operational picture and even a single integrated war plan. But in reality, 10 or 15 years ago, Anne-Marie Slaughter or the Farideh Zakaria said that this world is unwillingly connected. But I quoted those similar terms. I can describe this. This is the unwilling connected theaters. They are connected, not because we intended it, but because the crisis and the conflicts can spread across the regions. And because the United States has limited resources that must be shared across both the theaters. So today I would like to talk to why these theaters have become connected, what obstacles prevent us from managing that indivisibility, and how we might overcome the obstacles. So it might be this session connected naturally to the next session. So let me begin with the drivers behind this unwilling indivisibility. As we have already discussed yesterday, I did not touch upon the detail about it, but China, Russia, North Korea and Iran, those countries, the mutual relations and the cooperation is becoming more deeper than before, obviously. So this is the first driver behind the unwilling connected theaters. But second driver, or I should say the feature, is that the carefully coordinated cooperation among these adversaries is not necessarily required for raising the risks of simultaneous multi-front contingencies. What I mean by this is the crisis or conflicts can still become connected to even without deliberated planning by adversaries. Let me give some example. Let's look back to some situation during the World War II. Was the Mussolini consulted beforehand about the Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? Did Hitler expected Japan to fight alongside them against the Soviet Union? Both are not. So that even though that the United Nations and its allies were forced into the two-front or multi-front conflict, multi-front war in the European theater and Pacific theater. So that the key lessons is that the theaters become indivisible, not because the adversary is coordinated well, but because the crises in the different region can occur in parallel. So that this possibility itself, the parallel crisis, is enough to connect it in the theaters. By the way, now the former Prime Minister Kishida's phrases, today's Ukraine, maybe tomorrow's East Asia. Now it's becoming something like the buzzwords now. But we should remind that it was a political rhetoric. So not a precise analytical comparison of the two security environments. There are the similarity between the European and Europe and East Asia. Yeah, I do not deny that, but at the same time, there are also important differences, many of the differences. So we should be careful over stating their similarity or overrunning from the one cases to the other. The theaters are connected, but how they are connected matters, and the detail determine how we should work together. So for example, the Ukraine has the relatively secure land access from the western side, especially the western part of the Ukraine, allowing the European allies to sustain it through the continuous overland logistics. But Taiwan has not such an advantage or luxury. If China chose quarantine or full-scale blockade or full-scale military campaign, the sustaining of the Taiwan becomes far more challenging for us. So this difficulty is amplified by the fact that, unlike Russia, which was constrained by the INF Treaty until 2019, and they could not mass-produce the ground-launched intermediate-range missiles. But as you know, that clearly China has already deployed more than 2,000 ground-based intermediate-range missiles. So in the Pacific region, the operational tempo and the pressure of the military logistics from the very beginning are the completely different scale compared with the Ukraine situation of the war in Ukraine. So this is why in any Taiwan scenario, the pre-positioning and the stockpile become far more important than the war in Ukraine. The third driver / obstacles is reality that, sometimes I repeatedly mentioned about the limitation of the US military and the political resources. These are the extremely limited, some before. The upcoming Trump 2 version national defense strategy, I expected it will release the next week, will likely maintain the one war force construct, meaning that US can decisively fight one major war, can only deter in the secondary theater potential conflict. So this limitation is not theoretical, it is very physical. It is reflected the most clearly in the US stockpile and the magazine depth defense equipment, especially the long-range precision guided munition and air defense interceptors. The data, like according to the DoD, or now it's DOW's, the fact sheets, U.S. Navy acquired only 1,234 Tomahawks over the past decade, roughly 1,200, meaning also that roughly 120 rounds per year on average. But during probably most of the people already forgot that what we saw in the beginning of this year, that the U.S. military campaign against at the Red Sea against the Houthi forces. The U.S. destroyers fired more than 80 Tomahawks in a single day, effectively burning through the 1 year procurement in the 1 weekend campaign. This is true that other precision-guided weapons as well, like JASM or LRASM, both are stealth long-range cruise missiles. Especially LRASM is particularly designed to strike PLA amphibious forces, and the surface vessels would be one of the key weapons in high-end conflict over Taiwan. Some of you may recall the footage or the video from the President Trump's visit the USS George Washington with Prime Minister Takaichi in Yokosuka past October. When he came down the carrier elevator from the aircraft carrier, he was gently stroking missiles to display next to him. That was Erasm. So that I don't know whether the President Trump understood exactly what is that, but not sure that the White House or U.S. Navy's public affairs team the certain did, which means that the people has the expertise to clearly recognize what does it mean. So the message was very clear. It is the ship-killing missile for Chinese. But there is a problem. JASM it's a few months ago that it was planned to transfer to the Ukraine forces, and also that the LRASM run on the same production line. So when the U.S. uses the JASM in the European theater or even Middle East, the future LRASM, the stockpile for the Indo-Pacific will be declined. By current procurement plan, by 2026, the U.S. forces will have only around 480 LRASMs, a stock that could be run out in a days in the high-intensity Taiwan conflicts. When I designed as a wargaming designer to create instant baseline forces, I usually use the one missile salvo by the subsonic cruise missiles. One salvo is consisted on the 40 rounds of the subsonic cruise missile, which means that the 480 LRASM can easily run out of the 12 or 14 times, so 13 or 14 times of the multiple salvos. So this is a magazine depth problem, is the core of the unwilling the connected theater issues. So now let me turn to some obstacles. So one of the, obviously, or objectively to say that UK and France have some of the strongest power projection capability in NATO. In case of the UK, has 2 aircraft carrier, around 40 F-35B the carrier strike fighters, 6 destroyers, 8 frigates, and 6 nuclear attack submarines. France has the 1 aircraft carrier, roughly 40 Rafale fighters, about 15 major surface vessels, and also the 5 to 6 attack submarines, nuclear attack submarines. These numbers matter, but they represent the total in forces, not that assets actually available for the deployment, not exact number of the mission-ready forces. So to calculation of the force availability varies by the asset types and the situation. Usually the unmanned system or uncrewed system can relatively easily to maintain some high operational readiness. But to be precise, the peacetime availability and the wartime surge availability are not the same. Usually, when we designing those type of the baseline forces, we usually assume to the peacetime availability is the 30% of total forces, and the wartime surge capability is roughly 60 to 70% of the total forces. But to simplify of the calculation, that the average the availability rate about 50%. So in practical terms, that even if the Navy lacks the strong on paper, only about half of its vessels and the submarines can actually deploy at any given moment, and often the fears and the multiple theaters demand attention. Once we account for the force availability constraints, so that the picture changes significantly. For UK and France, aircraft carrier can deploy to the Indo-Pacific, but only as a short and symbolic deployment, lasting a few months, every several years, and they are not persistent power projection capabilities. And yesterday, Sahashi Sensei mentioned as one of the surprises, but on this particular issue, basically I agree with that the British Colby, who now is served as the Undersecretary of War. Just in case, that we do not agree with that all of the agenda or the issue, but at least this particular issues, I agree with his opinion. But at the same time, I do not intend to criticize of the decision of the U.S. Royal Navy. Carrier strike group deployments can demonstrate solidarity in the peacetime, and may create some horizontal escalation risks that China must consider. But we need to be honest about what aircraft carrier means in the high-end conflict. In every serious war game, these type of the high-value assets is one of the hardest assets to protect. It is extremely hard. And protecting these type of assets requires diverting a large number of the Aegis destroyer for air defense away from other missions. So the point is not to discourage these type of peacetime deployments, but to calibrate our expectations and ensure that our efforts strengthen deterrence rather than stretch limited the forces across multiple demanding theaters. So how to deal with the reality? One suggestion is that to redefine our principal roles based on the feasible division of labor. Europe's most meaningful contribution is not to fighting in the Pacific region physically, but to stabilize of the European theater first, so that the United States can shift more resources toward more major potential war with China. That's the necessary work. The second suggestion is that to build across theater integration in logistics, production, and the supply chain among U.S. Indo-Pacific allies and the European allies. It's almost same as Liz mentioned. This has been difficult for a couple of the three reasons. There has been no shared requirements of the analysis across the theaters. Stockpile levels are treated as highly classified information, even among allies. And key components have not been standardized for multi-source production. These gaps now need to be filled. Third, and especially related on this point, and promising the suggestion is the rethink how we produce the defense equipments. The best case is, this is not a defense model, but one of the best case study is from Apple's processor, M series processor. what I mean by this is that they are designed, those processors, the designed and the prototyping by Apple in-house, but the manufactured based in the TSMC. Unlike these models, the most of highly capable missiles or defense equipment designed as like a tailor-made, specifically designed supply chain, which means that cannot to divert from other industries. But so in one line goes down that if in the case applying to the case of the Apple's M series processor or the chips, other lines can maintain some production parallel lines. Also, the shortens the production lead time. So this, if we are able to apply this idea or way to defense equipment production, key components like the solid rocket motors or GPS units could be produced on the interchangeable lines across the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea, or Australia. So this would turn the production capacity into share the long-term assets that the support to some both theater at once. This is how we move from the unwilling connected theaters to manageable connected theaters. So if we can do these things, then these unwilling connected theaters becomes a shared problems we can manage, not vulnerability our adversaries can exploit it. So that's my suggestion to the next session. I stop here.
Thank you very much. So 3 fantastic presentations from different perspectives. And I thought perhaps I could just reflect a little bit on what we've heard, because we've heard an awful lot. And then maybe ask a question or two to the panel as a whole, and then open it up for discussion. Accounting for the grace period, we have about half an hour? 15 minutes, just kidding. So maybe I will go straight to reflections and then ask you for your questions. So go ahead and prepare those so our panelists will have a chance to respond. So in terms of offering a few reflections on what we've just heard, first, it strikes me that all 3 of these contributions focus on the ways that the theaters are becoming more structurally integrated rather than episodically integrated. And each different presentation highlighted something different about this trend, from developments in the Arctic becoming more robust, both between China and Russia, but then also among other parties in the Arctic region, Europe's expanding engagement in the Indo-Pacific, the IP4's participation here with European partners. And all of this taken together suggests that the European and Indo-Pacific dynamics from a security perspective increasingly overlap that are relevant for long-term strategic planning. And I think the Arctic is a particularly interesting example for me, just because I know I focused a lot less on that. But the analysis on the Arctic really drives home the point that this is no longer purely a regional space, but one that is profoundly shaped by geopolitical forces. And whether we're talking about infrastructure or maritime routes or emerging security concerns in the high north, it's clear that Europe, Japan, and Indo-Pacific partners and North America have to focus on this region. I thought your suggestions for some of the practical requirements for what the cooperation could look like in a very demanding, challenging environment were really interesting. Focusing on improved situational awareness, capabilities suited to extreme conditions, and coordinating approaches among the various actors. This will clearly take a lot of time and investment. And as you mentioned, we're in this profound readjustment period. But it's clear that political and operational capability remains essential. Turning to Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, I'm always struck by the diversity of motivations from our European partners for engaging in the Indo-Pacific or having concerns about China's rise in that region. and what that means for them from an economic or securities perspective. It's a mixed bag. Countries are interested in engaging for all kinds of different reasons, concerns about resilience, support for the international order, economic interdependence. You mentioned mercantilism as a motivating factor. But the reality is that a lot of this engagement will not necessarily be a unitary engagement, but rather a coalition of the willing, working on particular areas of interest and salience for the actors involved. And so identifying where that cooperation is possible is incredibly important to its sustained success. And I also appreciated that all of the conversation here underscored that Europe's tools in the Indo-Pacific are not primarily of a military nature, although they certainly include military engagement, but rather these tools are economic, they're technological, they're capacity building, they're industrial cooperation related, and that there's an opportunity for the Indo-Pacific and European partners to find opportunities to create more space for cooperation, even as they are faced with lots of demands at home. And I think your comments on Japan and specifically on industrial-based challenges, military industrial-based challenges, are very well taken. One of the things that I worked on in my last job in government was putting together the agreement that went through the U.S. Congress on AUKUS, and the idea that you could get 3 countries, much less a larger number, to cooperate on really high-end defense integration is a tall order, but it is absolutely essential in my view. So I appreciate you really driving that home. And I think there is a real opportunity as our European partners and as Japan is increasing its investment in its own capabilities, as Korea has been mentioned several times as a shipbuilding expert, but also excellent capabilities in munitions and things of that nature. It strikes me that there's a real need to rethink how we do cooperation in this space and what types of assets we're prioritizing. So I guess if I was to take a step back and look across all these 3 presentations, I would say first, the drivers for cross-regional cooperation are getting stronger, whether in the Arctic, the Indo-Pacific, or in Europe. There's a growing recognition that we are not isolated from each other. And so while every strategy or approach will not be identical, it does mean that we need to figure out how to incorporate conversations that are taking place not just in Brussels and Tokyo and Washington, but in other capitals as well into account and maintain that connectivity. It also strikes me that prioritization and comparative advantage are going to be really important concepts for each capital to think about as they approach this integrated theater. Europe may not be a large-scale military power, but it has incredible assets in the Indo-Pacific, I should say, but has incredible assets in other areas, connectivity, standards, technology, and likewise, our Asia-Pacific partners can bring unique things to the table as Europe is looking to expand their own interests economically and from a security perspective. And then finally, it's clear that any sort of sustained or increased cooperation really depends on these 2 regional actors figuring out how to find cooperation that is sustainable and built on mechanisms that can endure political cycles. Here in Europe, we're going into another series of significant elections that are going to change and influence sort of the broader political discourse in which all of this cooperation sits. And yet, it's really important for us to find ways to have defense industrial cooperation, joint research, capacity building programs, shared maritime domain awareness, all of these things that we've discussed in a way that is institutionalized so that it can be sustained regardless of what happens from one election cycle to the next. So I think, answering the question this panel proposed is it's not really whether or not these theaters are fully indivisible. They are distinct regions. They have their own distinct dynamics. But I think the real question and what all these presentations really contributed to is identifying areas where there are growing areas of intersection, whether that's economic security, maritime governance, or stability in the global commons. So that for me is the takeaway here, that we should all be looking for a clearer sense of where these intersections lie, what actors need to be brought to the table, and where there can be deeper cooperation without risking overextension. So I hope we can find have some more discussion on what those sustainable pathways might look like. So just to ask one kind of question, I'm a policymaker, not an academic by training, and so I've spent a lot of time with really boring things like regulations and budgets and things of that nature. And so the question I wanted to pose to everyone on the panel is sort of a twofold question. You all three have described increasing links and interests between Europe, the Arctic, and the Indo-Pacific. And I wanted to ask what you think the primary source of that increasing indivisibility looks like. Is that a shared threat perception? Is it shared or compatible capabilities, economic interests? If you had to pick just one domain where we were most coordinated, what would that be? And given your answer to that question, where would you put your marginal resources first to build this type of cooperation up? Thanks.
It's the final part of the question. It's just the final part. I'm sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, just priorities and marginal resources. Where would you put limited resources to achieve the greatest outcome in terms of building this connectivity?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. As you mentioned in your excellent remarks, Europe is, of course, a panoply of voices with very different strategic interests depending on the country you're focusing on. And so it's hard to actually give a pointed answer with specific reference to this beast with multiple heads, that is the European Union, or in fact Europe as a whole, if you count in the United Kingdom. But I do see certainly, to answer your question, which is something I did not emphasize in my presentation and I should have, I certainly see a lot of growing anxiety surrounding China, starting with its behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, as mentioned, this has been reinforced by China's own pro-Russia neutrality, to use this kind of oxymoron, during the war in Ukraine. But I would nonetheless emphasize other factors than cynicism and skepticism about China. I think that on the security projection, on the security contributions of Europe in the region, I would still point at economic goals, including in the procurement market. And so here I do see the interest in propping up US grand strategy by producing warships or mercantile ships or icebreakers as a driver, precisely because Europe is stagnating economically, and it is at the very core of your final remark, but is the tension between the need for strategy vis-a-vis short-term goals and the need to sort of make sure that these efforts are sustainable across political cycles. And so I still think that, almost in a Marxian way, the economic substructure is exactly what drives the policymakers' agenda, because it creates jobs. It creates jobs in the manufacturing industry, which are important in terms of, political support. And Europe is stagnating. And so to that effect, countries with a strong manufacturing bases, including Italy, and a degree of military industrial complexes, will want to chip in the efforts of sustainment, logistical support, and interoperability for the purpose of course, of defending their industrial champions, including in the defense domain. Then this is my biased, perhaps very partial answer from, I would imagine, especially big member states of the European Union, but also the United Kingdom. Yeah.
So I would argue, looking at the Arctic, that what drives the allied countries together to work on it is that they face quite serious threats from Russia. They're not the same threats. So Russia, for them to be able to position itself as a great power that influences other countries' actions, they need to have a credible nuclear threat against the US homeland. And they do have that because of unsurveyed airspace, because of lack of underwater capabilities to track the submarines they get through as it is now to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's difficult to find them. They can also go to the White Sea and target the United States from there. If you look at the trajectories from nuclear weapons, they go from Russia towards the US, they go over the North Pole and Greenland because that's where they have a good chance of not being intercepted. And so for the US, that has clear priority. Something needs to be done. But for Finland and Sweden, they're Baltic nations. They're threatened and they're worried about Russian threats in Eastern Europe and what's going to happen to the Baltic nations, etc. However, the way Russia operates, its operations in the Baltic Sea will be coordinated with its operations in the Arctic and the Barents Sea, because it will have to have its submarines coming down, for example, to assist in the Baltic Sea area if that is where a war starts, in which case the task of Sweden and Finnish people is to keep Russia from exiting into the Baltic Sea so that the warfare doesn't spread, and then someone else has to hold the northern theater. So even if you have different threat perceptions and concerns about what's going to happen immediately, the way that Russia operates will kind of force these countries to think as, a joint kind of force. And I think, so these, as I said, different threat perceptions is not an obstacle, it's an opportunity to give different countries different deterrence and defense jobs kind of in the alliance. And how to prioritize resources, I think it's going to be very difficult to do this as a NATO effort because, as we said, it's selected countries that have a major interest in doing something about different challenges. In this case, the Arctic, it will be the UK, it will be Norway, Kingdom of Denmark, Finland, Sweden is also involved, the United States and Canada. I also think you should involve Japan because of their closeness to the Okhotsk Sea, where Russia has their bastion defense, which is why the submarines and stuff going up to the Arctic will come from there. But they're selected countries, and NATO, I don't think that, even if, as some NATO officials point out to me, well, if the US wants something to happen in NATO, it will happen, and that's true. But that doesn't mean it's the best coordinating forum. I think an extended ice pact makes more sense, and that is slowly but surely getting off the ground. I was at the inaugural session 2 weeks ago in Washington. So that kind of would allow the countries to discuss who does what in terms of deployments, acquisitions, and I think that's the first essential step, because it's so expensive to operate there that I think, in a way, Denmark is accused, or the Kingdom of Denmark, of not doing enough. But it's important to be clear before we invest in expensive ice-strengthened patrol vessels or other things, what is exactly Denmark's role in this. So I think it makes sense to have the forum before we have the major investments. So thank you.
Well, the clear answer, the most simple answer to your question is that Japan's first priority is the homeland defense of Japan, related to the Taiwan contingency scenario. But that is obviously major independent variables to the future force planning of the Japanese self-defense forces. But more broadly to say that in the strategic community, the phrases like the tailored deterrence or the regional tailored approaches have long been commonplace. But the notion of the tailored deterrence should evolve into the layered, multi-layered, the cross-regional alliance coordination. The practical structure for aligning the expectations, commitments, and readiness across the allies under the multi-theater, the pressure. For example, again, if we expect to assume that to respond in some Taiwan contingencies, obviously the first layer, Taiwan and the US should be a first layer to respond it, like almost the frontline states. And I do not say that Japan, do not want to say that Japan is the second layer. Probably Japan should be a 1.25 layer. But the second layer, as a role of the main support, I expect it to the Australian cooperation. The third layer is almost role as a supplemental support to the logistics, other part of the things. Is the South Korea NATO partners should be a third layer in the Taiwan contingencies. But for the war in Ukraine, the Ukraine should be a first layer. Of course, that they are the first layer or primary actor of the frontline states. But as a second layer, NATO may be some 1.5, but also the US should be a main support to the war in Ukraine. And as a third layer, Japan and other Indo-Pacific partners maybe provide some significant indirect support to maintain their warfighting sustainabilities. The Korean Peninsula, the ROK and the US should be a frontline states, but the Japan might be some 1.5 or a second layer as a main supporter. And the other United Nations countries, the participants, will be the third layer, supplemental role of some contingencies happen in the Korean Peninsula. And the South China Sea situation, the Philippines and Vietnam should be a frontline states, and US and Japan might be able to the main supporter as a second layer. And as a third layer, the Australia or other major ASEAN states or partners might be able to the supplemental roles in the South China Sea contingencies. So what I mean by this is that we don't need to act or behave all at the time, the shoulder-to-shoulder cooperation. It is not necessarily the work. But the point is that to share that, also that it is not necessarily to share the exact same threat perception each countries, but we need to share that more transparent framework and our expectation. Also, what we need to do in each cases of the different scenarios. Those transparency is essential to the more effective coordination.
Yeah, do we have any questions before we break for coffee? I know we're standing between you and caffeination.
Quick question for Julio on EU-Asia connectivity. And because I think you mentioned EU try to forge trade links, right, with the region to align with the EU de-risking agenda. Right? So maybe maybe we can focus on FTA. The EU has 4 FTAs, I think, so far with in the region, East Asia and Southeast Asia. So South Korea, Japan, in Northeast Asia, and Singapore and Vietnam in Southeast Asia. And I think EU is using this building block approach, eventually hoping to reach something between EU and ASEAN, like an interregionalism deal. So I was wondering whether how do you assess this possibility of a future EU-ASEAN FTA? Because EU has pathfinders agreements with Singapore and Vietnam. So who would be likely to be the next after these 2 countries? Thank you.
So when I mentioned connectivity, and I did not unpack it because for lack of timing, or rather for me being the overloquacious Italian, I was referring to the provision of government financing for infrastructure or capacity building to middle income or developing countries in the region in the context of strategic competition. So this is just to mention connectivity and to provide a definition. I was effectively referring to the Europeans' response to the Belt and Road Initiative and to also potentially collaborate with Japan's Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, what at the G7 level was briefly called Build Back Better World. So it was really aimed at the strategic dimension of government financing with an emphasis on the very fact that we lacked it. We lack it in the region precisely because Global Gateway and the EU-Japan strategic partnership has not been very clear on deliverables in the Pacific for lack of coordination, because you have to align planets with donor countries, recipient countries, and especially among like-minded partners. And there is a strong competition and competitive logic. But specific to your question on FTA, what is interesting is that FTAs, of course, have been the remit traditionally of the European Commission, and they have a strategic dimension when it comes to diversifying supply chains. And so by virtue of having FTAs with countries around China, you have incentives in terms of moving out supply chains as well elsewhere, and potentially also socializing China to high standard FTAs, which was effectively what the TPP originally was meant to be. The thing is that now the European Union is doubling down on FTAs, not just because of the China challenge, which is understood as a massive economic competitor and an economic player that does not have a level playing field, but has its own state-sponsored industry with dumping practices and unfair competition. You do have this drive towards FTAs because of the challenge posed by the United States as well. And so there is clearly an emphasis on signing up FTAs around the world, and at the cost also of toning down the European Commission initial emphasis on due diligence, for instance, on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, on palm oil. And this effectively allows the EU to have potentially a trade deal with Mercosur, with India by next year, and India is a very protectionist country with a lot of double standards, and with Indonesia. As you know, the problem with Indonesia has been palm oil, right? So I'm still very skeptical about an ASEAN-EU FTA, but I think that the logic is precisely the one I've mentioned earlier. And there is a strategic component because it allows for the relocation of supply chains and securing new supply chains. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a question to the old girl, son. Sorry, I'm sorry if I. Thank you very much. So, you explain UUV, AUV deployment by the European and Indo-Pacific countries as stabilizing. So, in the sense of the mitigating the Russian and maybe Chinese nuclear cooperation or threats. But from Russia's perspective, wouldn't this UUV cooperation or dense UUV presence in the Arctic look like a direct challenge to the Russia's second strike capability? So how do you think such deployment might affect Russia's nuclear doctrine and maybe allowed postures, both in peacetime and the crisis? And if it is a problem, then what kind of measures should be taken in order to avoid any escalation or avoid to make them misunderstood? Thank you.
Well, that's the $1,000 question. It's really hard to answer. As I mentioned, there is an escalation risk of being more offensive, but it's also very clear that at present it doesn't work what we're doing. Russia has expanded its area of operation for its submarines immensely. It has managed to, like the Sea of Okhotsk is by and large a Russian sea today, where we have no access, but China has access. So I don't see that we have, we're simply not showing that we're doing anything to coordinate what we do. And I think that's a necessity. And then the question is, how far would you go? And I think some of the more sort of first things to do would be, for example, to create this ISR network, just so that, we can see and track what's going on, maybe even down to Australia. Some of my officer colleagues would argue, because Japan is already up coordinating ISR with Australia, but all the way, I think, up to the North Pacific on that side. And then since South Korea is planning to open a container route anyway on the Northern Sea route, that would also be, I think, a not too escalating presence to establish. In the Barents Sea region, I think it's absurd that we don't know what's going on in the Greenlandic fjords. That's unacceptable. I don't think that's escalating. What's unnatural is that the airspace and the waters and then we have all these P-8 aircraft, but in areas with floating sea ice, you cannot use sonobuoys. It's not working. And it's pretty obvious to Russia that that's not going to, be enough. So don't think it's escalating to close those gaps. It's what's weird is that they haven't been closed already. And that's negotiable. Radar stations in East Greenland, but you might want something more. Because the problem now is that from Pituffik in Northwest Greenland, you can't look through the ice sheet with current technology. That may change, but that's why Pituffik has, there's blind angles from there. Satellite surveillance has been difficult. Also, again, technological develops are ongoing, but I think that's a pretty urgent, to me, thing we need to do. So, and then again, I said, I think we should consider a more offensive posture. So Russia has just conducted a very successful, clearly military exercise with sea drone, sail drone operations, etc., in Norway's exclusive economic zone. I think we should respond by something similar. Again, I think that's, like tit for tat. I would call it again a bit strange if we didn't. They have base sharing arrangement with China near Japan. We need to do something similar, I think, to just show, we're on the case, we're there, and, we're kind of at least responding to their level. Initially, that may lead to some escalation, but I think if we do nothing, this region is sort of entirely, is going to be entirely a Russian, Chinese region in a way that we don't really want, especially since, as I tried to explain, the Arctic region is connected to what goes on in the North Pacific and the Baltic Sea region. So it's not that you necessarily expect a major war to break out in the Barents Sea, but if a hybrid situation escalates in the Baltic Sea, for example, which is not so unlikely according to most intelligence services in Europe, it will also influence military operations in the Arctic Sea. It will escalate to there because Russia will have to use the forces up there and connect the two theaters. So that is why that also for Finland and Sweden and further down, the Arctic is also a concern. But how to avoid escalation is obviously the $1,000 question, which is not very easy to answer. But I think we can do something to have more deterrence and to make Russia think twice again about its current use of its submarines.
Final questions? Going once, going twice? Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Hello, everybody. So welcome back. We have the last panel for today, and it's taking stock. What kind of inter-theater collaboration is possible? Collaboration in new domains, intelligence, sustainment, and defense industrial cooperation. What realistic military role for Europe in Asia and vice versa? And we have today Mary Yamamoto, Research Fellow at Mitsubishi Research Institute, Fabrizio Bozzato, Senior Research Fellow at Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and Sayuri Romei, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So I will go with the order, and I will give the floor to Mary Yamamoto, please.
Thank you. First of all, Jiro-san, thank you very much for joining me to this session. And actually, I'm honored to be here to speak today. My name is Mari Yamamoto from Mitsubishi Research Institute from Tokyo. Today, I will talk about why space cybersecurity matters for Europe and Japan, and especially with the background, like with the United States in the background. Yes. Okay, quickly move to the next page. Okay, my presentation will cover three main points. Firstly, why space cybersecurity has become a key security concern for both Europe and Japan. And secondly, how the European NATO with the United States in the background addressing space cyber risks with focusing on the European Union's move to build a space-specific regime, such as EU Space Act. And thirdly, what these differences mean for space sector companies, service providers, and other stakeholders that must comply with multiple regulatory frameworks, and also for future EU, Japan, or NATO Japan cooperation. So let me start with why space cybersecurity matters. Space systems such as satellite communications, GNSS, and Earth observation now underpin military operations, crisis response, and many everyday critical services such as communications, navigations, legislations, logistics, finance, energy, and disaster management. And also, commercialization and global supply chain have multiple actors and created complex dependencies across borders. So this brings innovation and lower costs, but also new systematic risks and strategic vulnerabilities that no single country can manage alone. Okay, here I will introduce the shared view and different lenses from EU, NATO, Japan perspectives. The EU and NATO and Japan therefore all recognizes space as a core layer of national power and see government and commercial satellite as part of this security and economic infrastructure. At the same time though, they look at space sector through a little bit different lenses. The EU mainly looks at space through critical infrastructure resilience and the smooth functioning of the internal market and essential services. And also NATO focuses on allied operations, deterrence, and collective defense, and treats space as an operational domain alongside land, sea, air, and cyber. And Japan approaches space policy from both an economic security and also national defense perspectives, especially with focusing on security challenges related to China, Russia, and North Korea, and on keeping communications and disaster response landing. So these differences in perspective help explain the difference in law and policy. Okay, let me have a brief introduction of the current threat on space sector from the perspective of cybersecurity. Recent incidents make these risks very concrete. Some of you may know at the very beginning of the Russian's invasion of Ukraine, cyber attack on BioK service knocked out thousands of modems, disrupting Ukraine communications and causing outage for civilians and even wind farms in part of Europe. And at the same time, Starlink was deployed to restore connectivity where territorial networks had been destroyed. But the Starlink terminals themselves became targets for jamming and cyber activity, and SpaceX had to push rapid defense updates at constellation scale. And more recently, into 2024 and also in 2025, new malware related to acid rain and Chinese simulation of large-scale jamming against Starlink suggests that actors are updating both their tools and their concepts of operations. So these incidents shows that like commercial space infrastructure can be part of a military competition, and cyber and electronic attacks on space system can have strategic cross-border impact on civilian services. So here is a common view or common and different view of from the perspective of EU, NATO, Japan on threats. Across the EU, NATO, Japan, the core space-related cyber and counter space threats are broadly similar, with Russia and China at the center. But they are framed differently as hybrid threats to critical infrastructure in the European Union, as threats to allied operations and command and control in NATO, and as cross-domain threats to regional security and disaster resilience in Japan. So these different framing again influence what kind of rules and standards each actor's priorities. Okay, from now on, I would like to introduce the framework on space cybersecurity from the perspective of EU, NATO, and Japan, and also as the background of kind of the United States initiatives. So in summary, we can say that EU combines cross-sector cyber and resilience law with space-specific rules and guidance, and Japan uses hybrid defense information security requirements and voluntary guidelines for commercial operators. And the United States relies on more broader national security, cyber and space policy framework, which heavily influence both the European countries and Japanese policies. Okay, here is the EU and NATO's framework for space-related cybersecurity requirements. In Europe, our space cybersecurity is not governed by a single dedicated space cyber law. Instead, it is shaped by different state layers. First, onboarding EU law. Through national implementation, the NIS2 directive and CEL directive set mandatory cybersecurity and resilience obligations for essential and important entities in number of critical sectors, including the certain space-related ground infrastructure and services. On top of that, the proposed EU Space Act is designed as a sector-specific lex specialists to NIS2, adding more detailed risk management and supervision rules for space operators that provide services in the European Union. And second, on the as the guidance and baselines, NISA and ESA publish non-binding technical guidance. In LEO-SATCOM work, for example, proposed by the ENISA, it explicitly refers to US NIST standard and German BSI. So here, United States framework clearly serves as a reference, but they are embedded in the kind of distinct European regulatory project. And thirdly, on the NATO and EU-NATO context, NATO's strategic concept and space policies treat space as an operational domain and they frame cyber jamming and counter-space threats in deterrence and defense terms. The 2022-2023 EU-NATO Joint Declaration calls for closer cooperation on hybrid threat, cyber critical infrastructure, and space. So these documents do not impose direct legal duties on operators, but they strongly influence the strategic and planning context. Okay, here is an introduction of the Japan's framework for space-related cybersecurity requirements. Japan is gradually putting in place a space sector cybersecurity frameworks through a combination of law, procurement standards, and guidelines. For space systems related to defense and national security, information security requirements in defense procurement play a central role shaped in dialogue with the United States RMF practice. So for the, on the other hand, for the broader community of commercial space operators, Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, METI's guideline encourage voluntary cybersecurity efforts and also refer to domestic and international frameworks such as NIST CSFs proposed by the United States. In parallel, NATO and Japan individually tailored ITTP for 2023-2026 identifies cyber defense and space security as priority emerging security issues. So cooperation on space and cyber emerging technologies and strategic communication is intended to enhance interoperability and address space-related cybersecurity and resilience in the defense-oriented setting. So as the quick introduction of the United States as the strategic security partner, the United States, I think the United States remains as indispensable security ally for both Europe and Japan in space and cyber through NATO and Indo-Pacific alliances. From a regulatory perspective, however, the United States does not have a single space cyber law. Space systems are covered by broader national security, cyber, and space policy frameworks. So this United States framework heavily influenced both European guidance and Japanese defense requirements, but they exist alongside the European Union's emerging space-specific regime, such as EU Space Act and Japan's hybrid approach, rather than kind of replacing them. Okay, here let me conclude with the 3 implications for space cybersecurity corporations. First, although both the European Union and Japan often refer to United States guidelines and standards, for example, NIST documents or I proposed in previous pages, the European Union's move to treat space as critical infrastructure, including the proposed EU Space Act, can be understood as an autonomous European development rather than simple extension of United States approaches. So recognizing this is important for European Union, Japan, and also NATO-Japan cooperation. And secondly, instead of aiming for single common rulebook, more realistic goal is to translate EU and Japan rules and guidelines to make overlaps and differently explicit, and to improve interoperability and legal predictability for organizations that must comply with multiple frameworks with United States practice often in the background. And thirdly, as the defense use of commercial space grows in recent years, with satellites, ground stations, and data flows increasingly across national and regional boundaries. So it becomes more important to reduce unnecessary regulatory friction So I mean, like instead of each jurisdiction sending different signals, Europe and Japan can try to give industry clear and more like consent message about the cybersecurity related to space sector. So, okay, I hope this overview can serve as a like starting point for future discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we'll give the floor to Fabrizio Bozzado, Senior Research Fellow at Sasakawa Peace Foundation.
Very well, we are ready now. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Well, the question that we all endeavor to answer is how indivisible are the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific securities. So today I would like to explore how connectivity, maritime, digital, cyber, and space is reshaping global security and why this matters for both the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theaters. Those two mega regions are often treated as separate strategic worlds, and often in our mental map they still are, but in practice they are increasingly interconnected and fused together by the infrastructures that sustain our economies and societies. My goal is to show how this inter-theater logic works, where the vulnerabilities lie, and what it means for Europe-Asia cooperation. So this is the structure of my presentation. I will begin with the strategic logics linking the two theaters. Then I will look at critical infrastructures, maritime, subsea, cyber, and space. After that, I will highlight one strategic node, Taiwan, and one strategic initiative, the India-Middle East-Europe Corridor, IMEC. Finally, I will outline our key policy implication for Europe-Asia cooperation. So my first point is that the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific are no longer separate systems. Globalization created interdependence, and digitalization accelerated it. Today, commercial and security systems across these two theaters are linked by shared supply chains, digital networks, and energy flows. This means, first of all, that shocks are now inherently trans-regional. For example, a maritime crisis in the Red Sea affects European and Asia supply chains. Cyber operations launched in Asia, for example, from North Korea, could hit European critical infrastructure. Energy competition in Europe, because of the conflict in Ukraine, is reshaping LNG flows in Asia. Connectivity creates, in other words, structural spillovers, making the stability of one theater impossible without the stability of the other. So, why does connectivity matter? Connectivity can be seen as the operating system of global security. Three domains illustrate this clearly: maritime corridors, the shape and resilience of supply chain; subsea cable networks carrying almost all global data, finance, communications, logistics, personal messages, defense, you name it. Cyber networks link industrial and financial systems across continents. The implication is simple but powerful. Whoever builds, controls, or protects connectivity gains strategic leverage. Conversely, whoever depends on fragile connectivity becomes strategically vulnerable. So, critical infrastructures are increasingly instruments of statecraft. We can identify three trends: state weaponized infrastructure to shape geopolitical outcome, control over choke points becomes a source of leverage, and infrastructure resilience becomes a measure of national security. This is why investment strategies, supply chains, and diversification, and digital security frameworks are now central to geopolitical competition. Europe and Asia depend on some of the world's most congested and vulnerable maritime arteries. And those arteries are characterized by choke points. For example, one choke point is the Suez Canal. In the same region, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Strait of Hormuz, and very famously, the Malacca choke point, the Strait of Malacca. Increasingly, the Taiwan Strait now functions because of semiconductors, as E, not D, but E, global shipping center of gravity. Recent disruptions, whether in the Red Sea or the Black Sea or in the Baltic Sea, show how quickly maritime shocks ripple across Europe-Asia trade. Inflation, delays, rerouting, and insurance premiums all increase. Maritime corridors, in other words, are the physical backbone of inter-theater connectivity. Then, connectivity is cross-domain, trans-domain, so we have the underwater domain, where we find subsea cable networks. There are the global communication digital arteries. Subsea cables carry over 98% of international data traffic, and this creates a single integrated digital space linking Asia, Europe, and North America. But the system is fragile. Cables can be sabotaged or accidentally cut. Repairing them requires time, equipment, and calm seas, and entire regions can lose connectivity. We are already seeing incidents in the Mediterranean, Red Sea. Taiwan is a target of cable sabotaging. The Baltic Sea, quite recently. So the takeaway is that digital infrastructure is becoming a shared strategic vulnerability, and protecting it requires monitoring, mapping, and response across the two theaters. Behold the global internet. You see, it is a system. It's a global system. Is it basically impossible to even analytically approach it with a compartmentalizing logic? So then we have the cyber domain and the cyber infrastructures. Cyber, well, we just enjoyed, I believe, if you say that, a very brilliant presentation by Yamamoto-san. Cyber is inherently trans-theater, and there are threat actors that we can identify. North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, they operate globally. They target include ports, power grids, logistic networks, finance, and telecoms. Exactly the system that underpins connectivity. A breach in one theater can propagate into another because global companies operate globally connected networks. This means that cybersecurity is now a collective resilience challenge, not a regional one. Then we have the space domain. The space infrastructure is the invisible architecture connecting maritime and cyber system, navigation, timing signals, Earth observations, you name it. And all these assets are now becoming contested. Jamming, spoofing, kinetic and non-kinetic anti-satellite capabilities, orbital congestion and debris. Since both Europe and Asia depend on these systems for everything, space cooperation, especially on space situational awareness, is becoming an essential pillar of connectivity security. Then I mentioned a strategic initiative, the IMEC corridor, India, Middle East, Europe corridor, launched in 2023. I have here the list of the memorandum of understanding signatories. India, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the European Union, Italy, France, Germany, the United States, and in the near future, probably Jordan, Israel, and Greece. IMEC is about not only about increasing connectivity, but also creating redundancy to make the system and global shipping less vulnerable. And also can be seen, because of this geography, as a corridor really linking the two regions. One might say, but it's linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, but please remember that the Mediterranean is part, even though it's 0.8% of the global ocean, is very much part of the Euro-Atlantic system, and up to 20% of global commercial shipping happens in the Mediterranean. You can see how connective this corridor is. So IMEC has three security implications: resilience, digital integrity, and energy diversification. It helps, it's not a solution, but certainly it helps to create a more resilient inter-theater architecture when it comes to shipping and also stability in the maritime domain. Then we have a strategic node. Taiwan is a textbook example of a strategic node in the global infrastructures. It matters for two reasons. It produces 90% of the advanced semiconductors. And secondly, it lies at the intersection of major subsea cable systems. This combination, technological centrality and geographical salience, means that Taiwan stability has global implications, including for Europe's industrial core. Let's assume that we are facing a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. That crisis will not be regional, it will be systemic, with three immediate effects: a semiconductor shock hitting European manufacturing, from cars to robotics, cable disruptions affecting global finance and communications, and maritime rerouting around the Philippines, adding to cost, delays, etc., etc. And this scenario makes clear why Euro-Atlantic and Pacific security are structurally intertwined. In other words, such a crisis will be a clear example of cross-theater spillover dynamics. We already see these spillover dynamics in action in other quadrants. The Ukraine war reshaped global LNG flows. The Red Sea attacks disrupted Europe-Asia shipping routes. And Asian cyber campaigns, Asian cyber warfare actors, campaigns or gray zone tactics actors, have targeted Europeans' critical infrastructure. And connectivity ensures that the geopolitical crises are now generate instant feedback loops across theaters. So there's recursivity, synergistic effects, systemic effects, between and across the two theaters. What can be Europe's roles or Europe's role? Europe can contribute with key capabilities that has acquired the post-Nord Stream subsea surveillance system and expertise, cooperation with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, like-minded countries in East Asia, in the cyber domain and cybersecurity, and industrial partnerships in semiconductors and digital systems. Europe and Asia share an interest in protecting the infrastructure and connectivity because they depend on them. There are three priority domains that can be identified: joint protection of subsea cables through monitoring, mapping, and rapid repair frameworks, integrated cyber and ISR architectures for early warning and crisis management, for example, and resilient supply chain coordination, particularly in chips, digital equipment, and energy systems. And this cooperation supports stability in both theaters. So, what can be a policy roadmap toward a coherent Europe-Asia connectivity strategy? Well, we could start with strengthening maritime domain awareness and space situational awareness, integrating European and Asian capabilities. Secondly, we should strive to develop redundant digital and energy corridors, including IMEC and Indo-Pacific linkages, and coordinate technology security frameworks, especially export controls, investment screenings, and cybersecurity standards. This is all about building strategic resilience, not strategic dependence. So finally, some key takeaways. First, connectivity is now the backbone of Euro-Atlantic Indo-Pacific security. Second, critical infrastructure, maritime, subsea, space, cyber, bind the theater together structurally. Thirdly, stability requires cooperation, protecting infrastructures, securing digital systems, and building resilient supply chains. Taiwan and IMEC are reminders that single nodes and corridors can shape global outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fabrizio. So we'll give the floor to Sayuri Romei, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Please, Sayuri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, for your introduction. And good morning, everyone. Thank you to Giulio and EUI for including me in this really exciting discussion. After the significant and rapid changes and challenges that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the latest US elections brought about in the past few years, I think it's really important and about time that we discuss how the two theaters, and especially Europe and Japan, can cooperate. And we'll need to think a little more creatively about ways this developing partnership can complement long-standing and traditional alliances and mechanisms. As we've just heard from my colleagues, there are many different areas where Europe and Japan are working together. But in my remarks today, I'd like to focus on two aspects that I think are key and that where we can see important developments in the future. Defense industrial cooperation, of course, which was mentioned a lot since yesterday. And second, addressing and combating disinformation together. First of all, on defense industrial cooperation. In this evolving and challenging environment, defense technology innovation and having a solid defense industrial base are indispensable. But this is an area where Japan has lagged behind historically due to the long-standing constraints of its defense industry and heavy reliance on US procurements. However, things have been shifting in the last 3 years or so. And in its 2022 strategic documents, Tokyo identified reinforcing its defense production and technology base as a critical component of national priorities. And since 2023, Japan has eased its export controls with the intention of making its defense industry more competitive by expanding access to overseas markets. And at the same time, Tokyo has also sought to diversify its defense procurement and development partnerships beyond the United States, increasingly turning towards Europe. Of course, as we all know, concerns over US unpredictability have grown in Tokyo, which has precisely elevated the importance of European partners for Tokyo's foreign and defense policy. It was remarkable that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte met with defense industry representatives in Tokyo, in Japan, during this past spring. During his visit this past spring, he met with Japanese startups working on drones, AI, space, quantum technologies. It was unprecedented for a NATO Secretary General to have this kind of meeting. There is clear interest by NATO in figuring out how it can work with Japan and other IP4 countries, specifically on technological innovation and supply chain resiliency. So there are clear signs on both sides to develop this cooperation further. GCAP was mentioned. Global Combat Air Program is an important example of initiatives in this area. It has been described as a new alliance by some UK, some Japan experts, because the multi-layered cooperation among the three governments, UK, Italy, and Japan, of their militaries, their industries, will inevitably strengthen security ties among the three nations. And in fact, my understanding is that Japanese officials and defense companies have long been frustrated a little bit with by Japan's extensive and asymmetric reliance on US defense collaboration and procurement, frustrations around complicated processes by the US regulatory regime, which has been described by some Japanese experts as a tall hurdle, US restrictions on the sharing of confidential technical information, and the inability to freely modify procured system without US approval, etc. And this context also explains Japan's eagerness to diversify its partnerships. And Europe, too, is grappling with similar concerns. It's looking to invest in its defense industrial base and reduce its security dependence on the United States, all while managing its relations with a more unpredictable Washington. Major European firms have already expressed a strong interest in working with Japan, pointing to the potential of a collaboration on advanced complex systems. And beyond GCAP, Japan is partnering with the UK on many different initiatives, universal radio frequency sensor technology, collaborating with France on mine countermeasures. And last May, Japan, France, and Germany concluded a terms of reference for cooperation on railgun technologies. So there's a real flurry of activities in this domain, in this defense cooperation area. That's also reflected by the fact that it was reported in May of this year that at Japan's Defense and Security Equipment International Expo, there was a significant increase of over 60% in the presence of European defense companies. So there are new developments there. And moreover, in July of this year, there was the first Japan-EU security and defense dialogue that was held in Brussels as part of the Japan-EU Security and Defense Partnership launched last November. So this, which is a new partnership that emphasizes the shared values between the two parties, expands the scope of military exercises, etc. And now the good news is that it's been upgraded to managing director general level kind of dialogue. So there are really interesting developments to watch in this area. And the other aspect I wanted to talk to you about today is combating disinformation by Russia and China. We talked about driving a wedge between allies and partners yesterday in our workshop, and taking steps to counter disinformation together is really fundamental, as the damage caused by disinformation is growing by the day, and it will have disastrous consequences if it's left unaddressed. Because one of the objectives of disinformation operations by China and Russia is to undermine democracy, damage credibility and commitment to allies, and of course, drive a wedge between allies and partners. Disinformation operations are always dangerous, but they're especially dangerous during electoral campaigns. And in the age of misused AI and deepfakes that quickly become viral on social media, they can easily sway the public opinion by creating distorted and false narratives, which can change perceptions. They sow doubt, and it becomes very difficult to reverse that kind of perception once it's widespread. So before going into what we could do, I'm also going to briefly address a question from yesterday's discussion about the extent and impact of Chinese disinformation in Japan. I think Japan is less polarized than the US, than the United States, for example. So my understanding is that Japan hasn't been as prone to disinformation as the US has. But in recent years, and especially during the COVID pandemic, there was a surge of conspiracy theories, and a Japanese branch of QAnon, so JAnon it's called, even emerged. And it is interesting to note that this recent development in this area had an impact in domestic politics as well. In the latest elections in Japan, a lot of voters turned towards new right-wing parties that emerged from YouTube channels that also espoused some conspiracy theories and spread anti-vaccine, for example, conspiracy theories, among other disinformation. But in general, the Japanese public already mistrusts China. So if people connect a certain information with coming from China, there is a higher chance that they won't believe it. However, when disinformation is more subtle or more sophisticated, it can definitely spread more easily. That's what experts call malinformation, which is the subtle manipulation of facts to create a certain narrative as opposed to complete lies. So it can be, for example, the reporting of real facts, real events, but they're told in a selective way, for example. A classic example is when Chinese media reported that the Okinawan people demand the complete review of US-Japan Status of Forces Agreement, when in reality, when you actually look at the facts, the protesters were specifically asking for stronger sexual assault prevention measures after the case of a sexual assault by a US soldiers stationed in Okinawa. So this is, again, selective narrative, but based on real facts. After Prime Minister Takaichi's recent statements on Taiwan, I expect we'll see a surge of disinformation operations by China. So I think it's important to be prepared. There has been some initial progress on how Europe and Japan can tackle the issue through flagship projects, through NATO. But I think it's still a little in the initial stages, a little nebulous. More needs to be done to address this and find effective ways to share approaches and best practices. First of all, I suggest a coordinated strategy and clear, consistent messaging using the same kind of language. And that can be reinforced by establishing a bilateral Japan-EU bilateral initiative or like a task force to monitor information manipulation during peacetime by Russia and China, and comparing the Chinese disinformation and Russian disinformation. Second, systematic efforts in educating the general public to think critically. That's the hardest, I think. So, but it's important to strengthen the engagement between governments and media and civil society. Governments both in Europe and Japan should make more efforts to close that gap with civil society, because what disinformation does is attacking the perceptions of the general public and tries to create distance between the governments and the public. And third, dedicate more funding or for joint research on information manipulation by China and Russia. So I'll conclude my remarks by mentioning one more item, one more area of cooperation that I'd like to throw out there for discussion. It's something that I think it's the foundation of everything we've talked about so far, but we haven't really said it out loud, like we haven't really addressed it directly, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I think it's really important that we develop a solid pipeline of Europe-Japan scholars and experts. So in this room, we already have a great group of experts who work on this. And EUI is doing a wonderful job encouraging this interaction. I think we all agree, but compared to the United States, I think Japan, for example, is not featured as prominently in academic and think tank spaces across Europe. The community is still so small. When I met with the new Japanese ambassador to NATO a few months ago, he said that one of his priorities is to enhance European understanding of Japan and Japan's security and foreign policy. He added that there is still a long way to go, and that Europeans still haven't developed many experts who have a deep understanding of how interconnected the two theaters are. So this awareness, we're in a bubble, we talk about this all the time, but I think this awareness is still very shallow. So I think while we need to make sure that cooperation on all these issues we've talked about are being tackled jointly by Europe and Japan, I think we also need to ensure that we're raising the thought leaders and practitioners who understand how high the stakes are. So, and how we can sustain this conversation for many years to come. So what can think tanks and academic institutions across Europe do to give Japan and the Indo-Pacific more visibility? And likewise, is Japan working to raise the next generation of security and defense experts who can talk not only about US-Japan alliance issues, but also Europe-Japan? I think we live in a time that's very favorable to start investing in this. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sayuri. Thank all of you for the brilliant presentation. I've learned a lot today, and let me say that I have more questions than comments. As an historian of international relations, I think it's my role to have a question. We do in this panel, but in those 2 days, we have heard some recurrent keywords. And well, first, two scenarios, Ukraine and Taiwan. We all know how Ukraine, as the war in Ukraine has changed the way we think the present and how the same international relations are defined. We do know that a war in Europe, a war can happen, and it is happening. Taiwan has been clearly stressed as the possible crisis, a crisis that will have way more deep implication than Ukraine probably. And then some other keywords which are mostly geographical elements: sea, Arctic, island, and space. Those are all elements or scenarios which are we can somehow oppose to the idea of land, so to the idea of war that as we thought in the Second World War, but even in the aftermath, the 2 decades after the Second World War. And then another elements, keywords recurrent is the connectivity, interdependence, interoperability, and network. So we found ourselves more and more immersed in this integrated system. And going back to Taiwan, to the next possible scenario, I think that it is really important to understand and to analyze what and why a conflict for Taiwan might be relevant. First of all, a question that has been asked many times is how can we define a war for Taiwan? Is it going to be an invasion, naval blockade, commercial blockade? But what about the jamming? No? What about cutting off all digital communication through the island? We do know that this is kind of possible, and preserving and defending the submarine cables. This is a big issue because it's a question of overlapping of public and private interests. Most of the submarine cables are owned by private company, mostly telecommunication company, who is going to go there and defend those company. Again, going back to Taiwan is not only semiconductor, but is even data. Most of the data center are Taiwan owned, even if they are not directly connected to Taiwan. Those data are stored in Taiwan. A few years ago, the US asked Taiwanese company to bring back those data in the island. So what will happen with a total disruption of digital communication over Taiwan? And then we have a clear new role of Japan. I kind of fear speaking about this because we have so many Japanese experts, but maybe, you know, somebody coming from another perspective might be relevant. We saw an article today on the front page of the New York Times about Japan and Taiwan. It is clear the storytelling about Japan is totally different. It might be real, it might be not real, but we do all know that a storytelling is something that state actor promote. It's something that is the action of multiple subject, and it somehow express the reason of a state actor, but more than everything, generate a new perception. So we have at least the public opinion is perceiving Japan as a totally different actor from 4 or 5 years ago. We all know that this has already happened some years ago, but now it's clear to everybody, and it's there in front of everybody. We heard several times about the interconnection between Europe and Indo-Pacific, East Asia, and Japan. And there are so many questions that I would like to ask. First of all, regarding the space cooperation. So I would like to ask you, why did you choose this framework? No, why did you choose to speak about NATO and US and European Union? And let's talk about the elephant in the room. So US. Where is it in this balance? It is indispensable, and if so, why it is so? Again, about the overlapping of commercial, public, and private. How can we think the defense use of commercial space, and how EU, Japan, and NATO-Japan cooperation help to reduce them if it is possible. You spoke about the EU Space Act versus the Japan framework, and which are more or less the key difference between them. And then regarding Fabrizio, you stressed the strategic vulnerability and concept of interdependence, which is central to your presentation. Giving this framework of that deep interdependence, what kind of vulnerability do you think are the most, the one that we are underestimating right now by policymakers in Asia and in Europe? Are we treating them as this theater as separate while we can no longer do so? And if you have to choose only one coordinated action in the next year or 2 years, which will it be? And in your opinion, is there a possibility to merge all those needs, public, private, Asian, European, different state actors, multilateral dimension like NATO, European Union, Japan, maybe even ASEAN, because there's a lot of the cables and a lot of the shipping are going there. Is there a way we can think of some kind of level of coordination? Regarding Sayuri, well, I think that we already talked yesterday during the break about this academic cooperation. So I think that the last point that you stress is really relevant, because Japan, it's everywhere. No, we've been we were organizing a conference on Taiwan, and they told me, okay, well, we have to speak about Japan, and this didn't happen 2 years ago. Okay, it was like it was the role of Europe, because we were seeing from the European perspective, US, and maybe regional perspective, but no, now it's mandatory to speak about Japan. But still, it is true that we are missing, we have it, in this room we have a lot. We are missing scholar, young students who are focusing. We are even experiencing, so going there and learning Japanese and coming back here. How can we enhance this cooperation? How can we have more European scholar studying Japan? But I think that even the the exact same question can be inverse. How can we have more Japanese coming here? And how can we have more Japanese scholar trying to understand Europe for a European perspective, not only UK, not only Brussels or Germany, but even country like Italy or France. And you say that Japanese public mistrust China, and so my question is, what about the US and Europe? What do Japanese public opinion and Japanese public think of US and Europe as a strategic partner? Are they reliable in your opinion? So I will give you the floor for to answer, and then we will take some other question. Mary, you want to start, please?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me break my answer into several parts because you raised important several points. So first, like why I focus on the EU, NATO, and the United States and Japan. The coalition is these four actors currently shape most of the openly discussed rules, guidelines, and procurement standards for space cybersecurity. Especially the EU is finding a space-specific regulatory regime, and also NATO provides defense and deterrence framings, and the United States regime remains the main technical and security reference points. And Japan needs to navigate all of them. And for both like European and Japan, the US capabilities and alliance are central to space and cyber operations, and the United States frameworks such as NIST standards and RMF influence defense requirements and technical guidance. So, but at the same time, the European Union's attempt to treat space as a critical infrastructure, including the, as I mentioned, proposed the EU Space Act, is an autonomous European regulatory project and regulatory projects. So, as you introduced by like the United States remains essential as a security partner and reference points, but it does not like place the need for like Europe and Japan to articulate and coordinate their own space security regimes. And yeah, second, regarding the regarding the elephant in the room, namely China, like kind of, although like my presentation did not focus on China directly a little bit, but China's counter space posture, cyber operations, jamming, spoofing, or co-orbital capabilities is one of the main drivers behind why Europe and Japan are strengthening their frameworks. And in other words, China is part of the strategic context, even if not like the center of the fight. But and sadly, on the like overlap between commercial and defense space, and how corporate can reduce risks. Commercial constellation now support defense operations and crisis response and logistics and communications. So this creates share the risks across borders. So EU-Japan or NATO-Japan cooperation can help by the improving interoperability of baseline cybersecurity explanations, clarifying how incident reporting and supervision should work, and also like in reducing contradictory regulatory signals for operators active in multiple regions. So these do not like eliminate the risks, but they can reduce uncertainty and improve the resilience. And finally, like on the key difference between the EU models and Japan models, The European Union is, as I said in the presentation, European Union is moving toward binding the sector-specific regulatory approach through the kind of proposed EU Space Act, layered on top of the like NIS2 and CER. So Japan, by contrast, Japan has a hybrid system, defense information security requirements, shaped through United States-Japan dialogue, and also like voluntary METIS guideline, which is encouraging the commercial sectors to follow them. Both systems increasingly refer to like United States requirements, but their legal and institutional logistics are a little bit different. So my aim was to like explain how these frameworks interact and what this means for space operators that like have to navigate multiple regimes at once. Yeah, is that the question?
So please, Fabrizio.
Okay, very well. So salient vulnerabilities in the intertheater connectivity system vis-a-vis the general strategic outlook and mindset. First, subsea cables and digital infrastructure. We still tend to see them as commercial assets rather than strategic targets. Secondly, the interdependence of maritime and digital infrastructure, ports, shipping, energy interconnectors, logistics are now deeply digitized. So, for example, a cyber attack on a port operator in one of the two theaters can very quickly produce physical congestion and price shocks all over the system, across the two theaters, with recursive effects. Thirdly, single points of failure in key technologies, above all semiconductors. So again, a so-called regional contingency on Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait, will actually be a structural shock. Now, why do you believe that the theaters should be still seen separately? Because of mental attrition, planning, crisis scenarios, and even export control regimes are still designed on a regional basis, mainly on a regional basis. The operating system of security is now firmly inter-theater, but our mental maps, institution, and strategies are still largely regional. This gap itself is becoming a vulnerability. Then, as for the second question, probably I will recommend for the next couple of years a joint Europe-Asia initiative on subsea cable connectivity and security. Concretely, that will mean three things: share, mapping, and monitoring. We have to increase our ability to work together in undersea cable control, in seafloor mapping and undersea cable network monitoring. Second, share procedures and exercises so we do not have to improvise and fail probably when facing an emergency and a crisis. Thirdly, basic standards for resilience and redundancy. We need to harmonize regulations, protocols across the two theaters. So this means also practically creating more redundancy on the lines and landing points, prioritizing the most critical corridors. So that this will be a high impact and low regret investment on our shared connectivity. Is something that is not just advisable, but actually necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. So I will give the floor to Sayuri.
Thank you, Stefano, for these really important questions. Yes, you're right. Japan is everywhere, and we need to address that. Former Prime Minister Kishida's favorite phrase, that Ukraine today, maybe East Asia tomorrow in 2022, I think that has finally started to click in the minds, the collective minds, both in the US and in Europe, that the two regions are actually connected. It took a little bit of time, but I think it's starting to sink in. And I find that in media, in Europe, in European media now, also there is more coverage about Japan than there was a few years ago. More coverage on what the prime minister is saying in Japan, more coverage about the domestic politics of Japan and the very tumultuous elections this year. I think, well, it does help that Japan did have some changes in domestic politics this year. So I think there is growing interest in Europe. And of course, the United States is making it more difficult for foreigners to enter, as we all know. But Washington is also sending mixed messages about that. So it's the narrative that comes from the Trump administration is seen as unreliable, I think, at this point. But what Europe can do is take advantage of this brain drain from the US and just take this opportunity to get more young scholars, more people interested in working on these issues to Europe. But that also means that we need more funding. So I think we need more funding to create additional roles and positions across Europe. And I agree with you, not only in the UK, or Brussels, but across Europe. Italy is a very good place, for example, but sort of underestimated or more obscure. I think we need more fellowships for Europeans to go study to Japan or specializing in Japanese studies. And we need, Europeans need to become to think of ways to become more attractive to Japanese scholars and young students as well. On the issue of Japanese public opinion and how it's evolving, viewing the US and Europe, are they reliable? Are they seen as reliable? In my understanding, the Japanese public has become disappointed by the US, by the high tariffs, especially imposed by the US, and this whole very difficult negotiations on tariffs with the US that they saw as unfair. So I think that contributed to the United States being viewed as less reliable. So I think it was an Asahi Shimbun poll that came out recently that said that the Japanese public is now seeing the US less favorably. So I think that fell. And with regards to Europe, I think the Japanese public, in my understanding, sees Europe as generally favorable, but I don't think it has grasped quite yet that there are so many opportunities there with the US sort of creating this or potentially creating this vacuum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have some questions. So if we have 4, maybe we can take all 4. We can start with Liselot, Anissa, and Ludovica, and Aurelio.
Thank you. I just have a very brief question for Fabrizio because you emphasized sea cables a lot and sea cable cooperation. But so I've heard that quite a lot of the sea cable, communication will be transferred away from sea cables to space-based communication, for example. So I wanted to ask you how you see technological developments affecting your whole arguments. Are there technological solutions that can, make some of these issues that you point out better, or do we just shift the problem to another domain or sphere? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anissa Bagay. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here. My question is also for Fabrizio, and I think it aligns with your question actually, because you've mentioned the technical advancements being changed, but you stress a lot that connectivity is now a geopolitical relevant topic, that it's now the backbone. But I was wondering how much this is actually a new thing, because if you look at like Cold War energy corridors or Bretton Woods Marshall Plan arguably being also connectivity regimes, how much is different? So basically technical advancement changes in that area are of course different, but how much is there also like continuity and how much is change and what can we learn from history? Thank you.
Maybe we take Ludovica, then sorry, there's Bojun, which also asks. So we take Ludovica and then we go again with Bojun, Aurelio, and if we have some other question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions for Sayuri, actually. Thanks for the presentation, I really liked it. So I have 1 question for each of the topics. So you talked about defense, like the EU and Japan, and I was wondering if you have any take on like what is the situation for popular support for anything defense procurement in Japan, because I think we have a similar issue in the EU in the sense that you have strong domestic components that are not really in favor of anything rearming, right? Even in light of the war in Ukraine, which is a bit more of a concrete threat. So you might assume that public opinion might be easily swayed in the face of that. So I just wonder if there's a parallel with Japan in that or not. And the other question is on FEMI, because one of the things that I always wonder about when we talk about FEMI is how you can measure impact of disinformation. I know it's a big question. I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer to this. It's more of an exercise, like thought, I guess.
Thank you, Ludovica. So I will start with Fabrizio, and then we go with Sayuri, please.
Very well. Thank you, Liselotte, for your question. That also allows us to have a glimpse into the future. I will say that my argument is still very solid because numbers don't lie. 98% of global data traffic goes through undersea cable networks. Yes, in the future, we might see this percentage decreasing a little, let's say 90%, because currently, with the technology we have at hand, we can increase the data traffic carried by satellites, but of just a few percentage points. So yeah, I know Starlink is very hyped. There's a lot of investment in the space domain, connectivity and communications, but the reality of things cannot change overnight. Undersea cable networks will continue to carry the bulk of global communication, global data traffic for at least a couple of decades. Then, I may be wrong. Maybe 5 years from now we have a change of technology paradigm. But well, if we think in terms of scenario and probability, well, we have to still rely on undersea cable networks for having our societies and economies functioning for the next couple of decades at least. And as for the second question, well, during the Cold War, we had a markedly lower interdependence rate. We were living in a world divided in two. In Italian is economia mondo. So the world was functioning in a very different way. Now, with a degree of the interdependence that we have now, we might be geopolitically divided in a compartmentalized, I can say that, you see. But when it comes to economy, connectivity, digital connectivity, now it's an integrated system. So this means that if every effect is systemic, it wasn't necessarily the case during the Cold War. And also, the technology paradigm was quite different. Sorry if I keep mentioning the undersea cable networks. The amount of data that was possible to carry during the Cold War era, was just a small percentage of what we can carry now, and there's still room for improvement. So yes, it's for historians, it's very interesting to observe and assess how things change over time, and especially after the shift from the Cold War era to the, well, let's say, the end of history, not really. So it's, I think it's different. A comparison is a worthy exercise, but we should keep in mind that we are talking about two different words. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludovica, for these really, really interesting questions. Yes, I think outside of Japan, a lot of people have this image that Japan's public is overwhelmingly pacifist, and it has been fighting to preserve Article 9 and things like that. And while true, of course, Japan has this long-standing allergy to anything war, anything nuclear. Of course, it has known and talked extensively, Japan as a society, about the horrors of war since the end of World War II. So there is certainly this very strong pacifist sentiment. However, things have been changing in the past, I would say, 10 years or so. I think Prime Minister Abe had a strong impact on that, as, of course, by the Japanese public, he was considered a very conservative, very hawkish, but at the same time, the Japanese media has also started to, during those years, Abe years, has also started to talk more openly about security, about defense. And since maybe 2014, 15 or so, I've noticed a great increase in appearances by security and defense experts on TV very frequently talking about missiles, about North Korea, about nuclear programs and things like that. There are dedicated experts or journalists in Japanese media who regularly discuss these issues with different guests in Japanese TV, on Japanese TV. And that's something that was unthinkable, like, 10 years ago or so. But now it's very, very common. People have become much more used to security and defense. One thing that I also want to note is that for a long time after in post-war Japan, there weren't really academic programs focusing on security studies. There were more like peace studies, and if there was some history on security, it was primarily just US-Japan alliance and the history of it. But it's very recently again that we have academic programs that support that kind of study. So in the past 10 years or so, we have seen a surge of young experts in Japan who can talk confidently about security and defense. So I think that's to say that the landscape has changed a little bit. And so it was very interesting to see that after the release of the 2022 strategic documents in Japan, there was no reaction, like negative reaction by the public. It was pretty like it was received pretty well by the Japanese public. The Japanese public was also in surveys and polls by the Japanese media was said that they were favorable about these kind of like surge in defense spending, for example. Now, once the tax hike will hit, we'll see what the Japanese public will say. But I think as of now, the Japanese public is much more okay with this kind of evolution of Japan's defense policy and more defense spending. So I think that's a very interesting development to note in public opinion. How can you measure the impact of disinformation and Europe and FIMI? I agree, it's a big question. I don't really have an answer for that. But I think terminology is very important in this area, especially that's why when during my presentation, I said consistent signaling, using the same kind of language. These things are very important, I think. So I think Europe and Japan should focus on developing the same kind of terminologies on combating disinformation and maybe going from there. So there's still a lot to do, but it's a very difficult question, and disinformation is just so elusive at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you, Sayuri. So we have I think the last two questions, Bojun and Aurelio. If we aim to keep it brief on the question and on the answer, we might end within the 5 minutes late allocated time. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I'll be very brief. I have a comment that maybe is interesting for the speakers. I think that the underlying theme, one of the underlying themes of the panel is ultimately vulnerability to hybrid threats. And I noticed that Yamamoto-san mentioned strategic communications. And I think this is kind of an underappreciated issue, because with hybrid threats comes a problem of attribution. And that's inherently related to the hybrid threat in itself. And this creates a conundrum for the actor at the receiving end of the hybrid threats. And we see that in the underlying cases, for example. In the first case in January 25 in Taiwan, the Taiwanese authorities weren't able to provide a concise, consistent, coherent message on the threat, because there were different actors. For example, mentioned at the beginning was a Chinese attack, then they actually shifted the version towards an incident. We saw the same issue with the case in the Baltic Sea of a Russian-operated Chinese ship too. So I can see that there is a willingness to move towards an institutionalization of the response towards hybrid threat across the two theaters. Maybe policy actors and even our community of academics and think tankers also thinks about should also think about what are the standards for attribution, because attribution has to do with strategic communications, because you need to have a clear playbook to explain the public what is this threat. If you're not consistent with the explanation of the threat, if you shift the response, your own way to explain to the public why this is dangerous is affected. It becomes less effective. So strategic communications that in itself is a response to every threat seems to me like a major problem that is still under discussed in this field. I don't know what you think about it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I have one quick question for Maria-san. It's about AI, artificial intelligence, as just like other high-tech, new high-tech, it can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can help the cybersecurity specialists to improve the whole defensive system against hackers, but at the same time, AI cannot enable malign actors to launch the attack on either private companies or the government institutions' cyber systems. So I was wondering, in Japan or through the bilateral, multilateral platforms, if AI has changed the is discussed, and what are the strategies that the Japanese government is trying to implement this? Thank you.
Who want to go first?
Thank you very much for your comments. And that was important point, I think. I fully agree the attribution and the communication around it is becoming one of the central changes in the kind of current geopolitical environment. And also, like in many of threat incidents you mentioned, like from the Taiwan the core difficulty was not only identifying the actor, but also providing a coherent explanation to the public in the real time. And as you noted, this is particularly complicated, when private infrastructure or kind of commercial operators are involved, because governments do not always have fully visibility or authority over the affected system. So, yeah, so that's an important point. I have to take care of them. Yeah, thank you. And to the to the question from the Bonjour-san, I would like to answer very quickly from the you're talking about the AI system, and AI is already changing the space cybersecurity in the three main ways, I think. And defensively, it helps operators process huge volumes of telemetry and logs of spot autonomous faster. and also like offensively, it can like lower the barriers for certain attacks. And at the governance level, it raises new question about the like kind of transparency and responsibility and certification of AI-based operations. So like AI amplifies both resilience and risks, but like, so Europe and Japan like need to like embed it carefully into already like complex space system based on the kind of law architecture or some civil policy architecture. Thank you. That.
Sorry. Yes, reducing vulnerability to hybrid threats and institutionalization and clarity of the response. Well, I think that for a start, like-minded partners across the two theaters, from Europe to Taiwan to South Korea to Japan, need to speak the same language. Practically means sharing the same protocols, the same regulations, creating new organizations or institutions to assess the threat and communicate about them and about the actual attacks in a way which is clear and uniform and can rally solidarity for the other partners. That will also mean effectively waging the information warfare. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are done with the panel. Thanks to everybody. Maybe, oh, so you had, there was a question for you? No. So let's have a big round of applause for everybody. And now for the remarks, for the final remarks, I will give the floor to the mastermind of this 2 days conference, Giulio Pugliese, which you are all very familiar with, European University Institute. Please, Giulio.
Thank you. And no, this has been a very collaborative effort. And so I need to thank you guys for bringing so much food for thought and so predictable, high-quality discussions amidst the unpredictability of what has been defined as a revolutionary multipolarity order, or rather what many call increasingly an interregnum, a transition period between systems of international order. And this very disorder, at the very least, I've been able, and I can speak for Ken Endo as well, to actually draw up maps, predictably good maps from the consistently good quality interventions that I've heard over the course of 2 days. So thank you, guys. And I'll go full circle and echo Ken's introductory remarks from yesterday. I think we've been able to unpack the different threat perceptions across the two theaters, but also within Europe, and for a plurality of voices that have been lined up throughout the workshop. And we've been able to unpack also the different strategic priorities of the different actors. We've discussed them. And I think that amidst geographic limitations and institutional silos, there is momentum indeed for a modicum of cooperation and to really see inter-theater cooperation at the NATO IP4 level, at the EU Pacific partners level, those who have security and defense partnerships in particular, but also at the minilateral level and at the bilateral level. And I think that, and I hope that, to echo what's the very kind words from Sayuri emphasized, that we have been able to bridge that gap at the EUI and bypass mental attrition also through this workshop, complementing the very great work that also the GMF does on EU-Japan, on Europe and Japan, within the trilateral framework, of course, of the transatlantic remit that is taken forward at the GMF. So thank you for that, guys. And at the very least, we have built an epistemic community that has been reinforced among like-minded partners, at least in terms of like-minded in terms of discussion, like all good academics. But it's also true that there is momentum for more collaboration across Europe and Japan, as Japan and Europe negotiate at the EU level accession to the Horizon Europe framework. South Korea and the EU are already full associated. South Korea is fully associated with the Horizon framework as of 2025, and negotiations have started with Japan in November of 2024. And so there is then more space, even including more funding for joint cooperation and collaboration efforts ranging from STEM research, but also potentially in the humanities and social sciences. And so these bridges, the ones we have built at the EUI, hopefully will be leveraged also for this cross-theater research endeavors in the future. And on behalf of Ken, Endo, I thank you all for being here, and I hope and look forward to actually see you in the future. Thank you.